I am honored and very happy that we have as our keynote speaker today Professor Joan C. Williams. Professor Williams is a distinguished professor of law at UC Hastings and the founding director of the Center for WorkLife Law at UC Hastings. She is a graduate of Harvard Law School and MIT and has a master's degree in city planning. So that was her. And according to the New York Times, she has something approaching, it's a quote, she has something approaching rock star status among work-life advocates. Professor Williams won an Outstanding Book Award for Unbending Gender, Why Family and Work Conflict and What to Do About It. She has authored and co-authored 70 academic articles and chapters, 5 books, and the most recently is Reshaping the Work-Family Debate, Men and Class Matter. In 2006, Professor Williams received the American Bar Association's Margaret Burnett Award for Women Lawyers of Achievement. And I want to add that Professor Williams managed to transform theoretical issues to practical legal arguments, and at the same time to transcend beyond the legal discourse and influence and shape the attitudes and views of the general public regarding the issues of work-life balance. So I feel we have a lot that we can learn from her experience and knowledge, and I am really thankful that she agreed to come and speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. And actually, I feel really accomplished today because for you and for you only, I learned how to do screenshots. I have such a beautiful PowerPoint, so I'm very excited. It all starts out in 1986 when I had a baby. I had been a feminist since high school, but that was never my professional focus. I always tell reporters you need a very good soundbite for reporters, so I always tell them I was an environmental lawyer who had a baby when they asked me how I got into this. But that's not quite true. I was a legal theorist and legal historian. Whoops. Oh, I forgot to say also that I grew up close to New York City, so I talk too fast. So if you have trouble following me, just raise your hand, and that will remind me to talk slower. Okay? Deal? So I was focused on jurisprudence and critical legal studies. I was at Harvard Law School when critical legal studies was being invented and very involved with it. And then I became a law professor. I've been a law professor pretty much since I was born. Then I had a baby. And having a baby really hit me like a ton of bricks. I was of the generation, first of all, where we didn't try to even start getting pregnant until we had tenure. Consequently, I was almost infertile, and that was sobering. Then after I had my second child, I was so overwhelmed that I almost quit. And I thought, here I am. I'm actually, I was at that time had just been named one of the most prolific law professors in the country. I was getting offers from throughout the country. I loved my job. I was pretty good at it. And I thought, boy, if I can't survive, nobody can. This is just impossible. So I got really outraged. I got really, really angry. Meanwhile, sociologists in the United States had actually, this was a cross-cultural study, US and Britain, had documented that really what was keeping women back economically and impoverishing them was motherhood. The wage gap was not so much a gap between men and women, it was a gap between mothers and others. And in fact, the conservatives were very happily saying in the press that that there was no wage gap because women without children earned as much as men. Now, in some cities in the United States, women without children now earn more than men. And if you look at this demography, it's really women without children at age 30 earn more than men. So I wrote a blog called Want Equality? Die Childless at 30, saying this is actually not equality. So I was very influenced by this demography on the motherhood wage penalty. And so I decided to get into the work-family arena. Now, when I did, this was a dowdy, dusty backwater. People were going like, ugh, why would you want to do that? Don't call this work-family. Call it, like, you know, queer theory gender. That was where it was at, right? Actually, I'm very influenced by queer theory, but I was doing work-family, and people go, oh, that's so old-fashioned. So it was very dowdy, it was a backwater, and also American feminists had pretty much burned down the house over these issues in the early 80s, extremely bitter fights between what were called the sameness feminists and difference feminists. Sameness feminists basically said we got to treat women the same as men, because if we don't, we're going to get right back where we started. And difference feminists said, oh, by the way, women aren't the same as men, and so you got to treat women differently. They often said according to their needs. And so I was pretty alienated from sameness feminists. I got more alienated later on when I learned that the common forum in the United States to talk about feminists or people in Washington, D.C. and the Capitol is inside the Beltway. And inside the Beltway, feminists were so sameness feminist that when a California legislator came to them and said, I want to get you maternity leave, they told him, no, we don't want maternity leave. And they fought for another 10 years, during which time I had my baby with no maternity leave, to get the Family and Medical Leave Act folding maternity leave into all kinds of family leave and leave for medical conditions, because they didn't want to treat women any differently. That made me actually really mad too. One of the things I think that's really interesting and rarely talked about in cause lawyering is how to use anger as a tool of social change without having it corrode you from the inside. I've thought a lot about that. So I wasn't a sameness feminist, I wasn't a difference feminist, but I was a feminist who was going to go ahead and try to accomplish something. So that's where I started. And since I was a theorist, my first step was to reframe the debate. I really only have two skill sets. One is reframing, that means I'm a theorist, and the other is assimilating a huge amount of information and making it very, very imageable. Two really important skills for cause lawyers, although that's just one role. I play a very specialized role. So what I did is flipped the problem, and I said, let's really think about this. Think about the ideal worker. What is the ideal worker? The ideal worker is someone who starts to work in early adulthood and works full-time, full force for 40 years straight, taking no time out for childbearing, child rearing, or really anything else. And that's the reason that mothers are marginalized onto a mommy track. It doesn't have to do with choices, it has to do with the construction of work, the social construction of labor, although I would never say such a phrase in polite company in the United States, being a very anti-intellectual environment. It's also really interesting and intellectually challenging to be a theorist in an intensely anti-intellectual environment. I actually happen to love that role. It's very rigorous intellectually. So I took this theory in two directions. The first was into employment law. I do the ideal worker litany, full-time, full force, 40 years straight, taking no time off for childbearing, child rearing, and then I ask, who does that describe? Right? If you design work around men's bodies, no time off for childbirth, and men's life patterns, that's sex discrimination. The sex discrimination is at the level of the norm. That actually solves the sameness difference debate, because women aren't the same or they aren't different except in relation to the masculine norm. And the masculine norm is what's the problem. And so it's not relevant. Of course, if you're going to design a norm around men, of course women are different. That's trivial. But that doesn't mean they need different or special treatment. That means the norm is discriminatory. So that was the initial strategy in employment law. Then, of course, there was this little problem of how to tie it to legal doctrine. I also made an intervention in family law. I said, look, if you're an ideal worker, then you, the only way an ideal worker can go to work and build a career is because he's supported by a flow of domestic service from his partner, from his wife. And consequently, his wage, the family wage, at the time I was writing this, American husbands still earn 70% of the family income. His wage is actually the product of the joint work of him and his wife. And therefore, the family wages should be jointly owned. And after divorce, instead of messing around with child support and alimony and all the rest of it, and marital property was kind of irrelevant because we Americans don't save anything. So the chief family asset was his wage. And I argued that that was jointly owned. That's called the joint property theory. So I had these two theories, one an intervention into divorce law and one an intervention into employment law. I saw, and then actually the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation began to pursue me mercilessly with money. So I had to decide what to do. And I figured analytically there were four things you could do. One is you could change the relationship of public and private. And that's sorely needed in the United States because we have the most family-hostile public policy in the entire world. Notice, that took me a long time to make that phrase, right? It's a perfect phrase for television. That's the way you kind of have to sculpt things. So we have the most family-hostile public policy in the entire world. We really need public subsidies for child care, after-school care, elder care, care of disabled family members. We need workers' rights. We need limits on mandatory overtime. We need the right to request flexibility. Being the U.S., we also need vacations and other socialist things, and a lot of time regulations that we don't have. And you also need leaves. You need short-term leaves. My husband and I used to call the bites. Those are analytically three different things that you need in terms of public policy in order to reconcile work and family. So that was one thing you needed to do. So that was one strategy, change the configuration of public and private. Second was to change the relationship between the employer and the employee. And this was already well underway through the corporate work-life movement. There was a growing industry of people who worked with corporations as work-life, in work-life departments, developing family-friendly or flexibility policies. And I actually have been part of that. The Center for Work-Life Law basically invented the modern part-time policies, both in academia and in the legal profession. And so creating non-marginalized part-time policies was some of what we did. And then there was employment law. That's a third area that you can do. And then the fourth was changing roles within the family. American feminists typically have focused on changing roles within the family. My position there is that that's an epiphenomenon. It's not the right place to start. If men, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, if men get eviscerated for not performing as ideal workers, you know what? Women are going to lose in kitchen table bargaining, period, end of report. The structure of work drives marital bargaining. And so I thought that feminists were focusing on the wrong thing. That's not to say for all the young women you shouldn't try it anyway, but it's hard. So there I was. My first step was to give up on the joint property theory. I figured this is never, actually I did get a very rich woman $500 million through the joint property theory, but that actually was not my life goal. And I realized this is divorce law In the United States, it's handled through state legislators. When I gave speeches on this, I'm sort of a, Daphne Hochner, who was my student, I had the same thing. Men used to get up and scream at me, say, she hurt me and I hurt her and now you're trying to take away my... No way. This is not going to happen. State legislatures, I'm not going to waste my time on this. So I gave up on divorce law. Impossible. So I focused on employment law. And then I had to choose between trying to get legislation and working through litigation. And I gave up on legislation. The reason I gave up on legislation is because I wrote Unbending Gender, the book that started all this, in 2000 when George W. Bush had just been elected. And I said, you know what, nothing's going to happen. Why should I waste my time? And you know what, nothing has happened. I would have wasted my time. Inside the Beltway, feminists have been, since about 1985, focused almost exclusively on getting tiny crumbs for childcare and trying to get paid family leave, which we haven't gotten. And my reaction is really important to have somebody working on those long-term goals, really important not only to be working on very, very long-term goals. So I decided to use existing law, starting from this ideal worker analysis, basically because that's the only thing I could see moving the needle from A to B. And so I founded the Center for WorkLife Law. How do I do this? Next. Must be an easier way. Okay, so there's the Center for Work-Life Law. We now have a kind of a fancy web page. Very important to have a very imageable web page, and you have to keep throwing up new stuff. It is such a waste of time. You have to spend so much time reprocessing what everybody already knows. That's the way you get eyes. That's just life. So here you see, and in terms of one of the things that's really important for cause lawyers is to disseminate through a wide range of media. This is an article in the Harvard Business Review. I hang around with the Harvard Business Review. I hang around with management side, employment lawyers. I hang around with anyone who's going to help me move the needle. And so I am a big advocate for lack of purity. There must be an easier way. Oh, good. Okay. I founded the Center for Work-Life Law, which has now been around for 15 years, around a very specific model of social change, a very specific social change theory. We try to identify at any given time a few specific projects on which we can move the needle from A to B within a 3 to 5 year time frame, and if we can't achieve that, we don't do it. It takes a lot of analysis to try to identify those projects, but I think that's really important because once you make even a relatively small change, you change the cultural environment so that you can't possibly tell what the next change could be. So if you keep on working for the ideal thing for decade after, you're not making any change. Although that's also important. They worked on the Family Medical Leave Act for 20 years, and then Clinton came in, and all of a sudden they got it. So you need both, but it's very important to have both. And so we decided we were going to change employment law. And when we started, mothers were losing for 3 reasons in the United States. First of all, everybody knows motherhood's about choice, right? It's about choice, not discrimination. And so that was the first reason suits were being thrown out on the grounds that this was about choice, not discrimination. Secondly, was a technical reason. Mothers often couldn't prove their cases because who is a proper comparator, a similarly situated man to someone who's out to here? There aren't any, right? And the classic way of proving comparators, a employment discrimination case in the United States is to point to a comparator. So mothers were also losing for that reason. And third, they were losing because courts said, I'm sorry, honey, but your suit is about parenthood, not about sex, and parents aren't a protected class. So mothers were absolutely, none of these suits were, very rarely were they winning. The first thing I did with a co-author is wrote a 2004 article called Beyond the Maternal Wall, which was published in the Harvard Women's Law Journal. A couple of things about that. We're all social inequality people. You gotta use the hierarchy. I published in Harvard because I wanted the name Harvard. It wasn't even as highly a ranked journal as the other journal I was choosing, but I needed Harvard because I was trying to play a public intellectual role, and Harvard carries clout. So there it is. I didn't make the world. The other thing is that to recognize is at the time I published that article, I actually cited 26 cases. That's all. I mean, we were trying to gather cases that had never been gathered before. So, this article was brazen, very important. It was totally brazen. It was saying, mothers have a cause of action, and here are the suits that prove it. And I actually, I turned down interest from the Yale Law Journal, the main Yale Law Journal, because they wanted me to include not only the cases where mothers had won, but the cases where mothers had lost. And I said, no, that's not my job description. Bye-bye, Yale Law Journal. I'm not going to write employers' briefs. There's no way I can do what I'm going to do if I'm going to write employers' briefs. So I turned them down. And that's why I ended up in a women's journal. What we did in that article is we stitched together cases from under various different legal theories. Ultimately, we created this area of law, which is just a hodgepodge of 17 different legal theories, and gave it a name. At first we called it caregiver discrimination, because that's what it is, discrimination against caregivers. Actually, later on in the process, we changed the name to what it's now called Family Responsibilities Discrimination. And the reason we did that is because we knew we were going to end up before the EEOC with 3 out of 5 members appointed by Republicans. So I thought, well, how can we make this sound really, really conservative? Raise your hand if you're in favor of, if you're against someone who has family responsibilities. Don't you just hate that person, right? So we abandoned caregiver discrimination and started calling it family responsibilities discrimination. The other thing about that article, which was important, is that we, in a very deadpanned way, we said we were just describing current law. This is very different from an academic role, which is like, oh my God, I have this brilliant idea, I'm a rock star, right? If you do that in a system based on precedent, you're slitting your own throat. You're not a social cause lawyer. You're an egoist, right? You do pay a price. Well, actually, I haven't, but you usually do pay a price in terms of academic incentives because you're breaking the rules. You don't have a new idea because you're presenting your new idea as just old dowdy stuff that everybody knows, right? And so that's another strategy that I think is very, very important depending on your legal system. In the U.S., it's very, very important. And then the other thing I did, which is really important for the professors, is I worked with a litigator. I fake it, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm a legal theorist, right? I'm not a lawyer. So I worked with a litigator, Cynthia Thomas Calvert, who I've worked with for 15 years, who basically I couldn't have done anything without her as a business partner. And what we did is, first of all, we began a hotline. And I have to share one of the high points of not only my professional life but my life, when I came back one day and I picked up my phone. The hotline was on my phone at that point. And a woman said, this happened to me, and she described her story. And she said, and then I was surfing around and I found your website, and it was as if an explosion had gone off in my head. And I said, wait, this is discrimination. And I thought, wow, that's feminist naming. Wow, that is theory to practice. And I thought, this is really awesome. And so through this hotline, first of all, it makes it easier to put, to place stories in the press, right? Because you need to be working in the courts of law and the courts of public opinion because they're not different. I mean, they're different, but they're a strong feedback loop. So you need the real bodies. And then Cynthia did something that is even more important. We have basically, for 15 years, functioned as the unofficial legal backup center for all family responsibilities discrimination cases in the United States. Cynthia is extraordinarily brilliant. She's incredible as a strategist, and people were making all kinds of dumb mistakes because these were complicated cases because we were trying to litigate under laws that were not designed for this situation. All of which, of course, I stoutly denied in public, but was the truth. So Cynthia basically raised the quality of the litigation by working with private plaintiffs' employment lawyers to the extent that now in federal courts in the United States, 2/3 of family responsibilities cases, plaintiffs win. That is completely unheard of. And I think Cynthia has played a really important role in that. Of course, there's a whole funding story which I can talk about. The Sloan Foundation, if you want in the question and answer, the Sloan Foundation was in love with me for 10 years. Then they fell out of love. Try to fund this. That's a different story. And we have built up a database of all of these cases. We now have a database of over 3,000 family responsibilities discrimination cases. Also impossible to fund, but completely important for the work of the center. The second thing I did is, the second thing I did is I developed a model that has really proved very effective in creating social and legal change. It's a working group model. This is the Journal of Social Issues. It's a special issue on the maternal wall. The Journal of Social Issues I feel honored to be working with. This is actually the social science journal that published the social science that led to Brown versus Board on Education, the desegregation case in the United States. And this is the journal that I've been working with for now 10 years. So I assembled a working group with Sloan funding of litigators, plaintiffs' employment lawyers, and social scientists, experimental social psychologists, and gave them the charge of basically all of experimental social psychology was comparing men to women. I said, how about if we compare mothers to others? Never been done. Actually, there were only 5 studies, scattered, fragmentary studies. They did, and when they did, they found that motherhood is actually by far, by an order of magnitude, the strongest trigger for gender discrimination in the workplace. So the famous study which grew out of the working group is that, people gave identical resumes, one but not the other a mother, and the mother was 79% less likely to be hired, half as likely to be promoted, offered $11,000 less in salary. These were management consultants, and held to higher performance and punctuality standards. This bias is an order of magnitude larger than glass ceiling bias. Now, just a word about those figures. That's exactly the formulation that I've used probably 200 times. I actually had to work with the social scientist because the way she had presented her findings was completely not imageable. It was like, 24% as opposed to 49%. No. You need very, very soundbite, imageable figures, and then you need to drill them in again and again and again and again. So bringing social science into it was very important because basically we're trying to fit, that legal theory, the ideal worker theory, into Title VII, which is the basic employment discrimination statute in the United States. And the social science was the link. Because here is what really happens. You design work around men's bodies and men's traditional life patterns, and then stereotyping arises in everyday workplace interactions. And you use the stereotyping to prove your discrimination case. And that's exactly what we did. This is the landmark case. You can see this was pretty fast. The Unbending Gender was published in 2000. This was 2004. was a case called Back versus Hastings on Hudson. It involved a school psychologist who was denied tenure. She was doing great, and then when she got close to tenure, all kinds of comments like, "This is no job for someone with little ones." Not very subtle. But there was no similarly situated man, because she was a school psychologist. There are no male school psychologists. I exaggerate, but not much. And so under traditional law, she would have lost. And so, but what the judge did is took the maternal wall, beyond the maternal wall argument, and this is why it's important to be so brazen, and said, oh, well, you can prove these cases through stereotyping evidence. And I was going like, well, I knew that. We just made it up 2 years ago, but that was always the case. And so that's what Back versus Hastings on Hudson did. We hold that stereotypical comments about the incompatibility of motherhood and employment can certainly be evidence that gender played a part in an employment decision. As a result, stereotyping of women as caregivers can, by itself and without more, be evidence of an impermissible sex-based motive. That was what we needed, because we didn't have comparators in these cases. But boy, did we have what I call loose lips. Meanwhile, I had hired, as a project manager, I had hired a sociologist who had been a reporter. And what she said is, what you need is a report with one imageable statistic. She was the one who taught me this. And so she wrote a report that crunched the numbers and found that there had been a 400% increase in these cases over the prior 10 years. Now, we just saw that number and we thought, like, you know, God, I love you. I don't know why that was the case, but oh boy, you heard it all over. And specifically, we disseminated it to the general press and also to the specialized press. This is Human Resource Morning, right? You guys have a human resource officials, right? So human resources was very important. So here, family responsibility, a new name for a legal minefield for HR. And I go, yeah. We actually worked heavily with Business Insurance Magazine to get the very first article saying, oh my gosh, this is terrible, you have new potential liability, was in Business Insurance Magazine. I go like, that's perfect. Meanwhile, we were working with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. I happen to know two people at the EEOC. There's a lot of, for sociologists, there's a lot of amazing, cool social network stories. This is a social network saga, but I will glide over that. So I know two people from the EEOC, and we were working closely with the EEOC, and it was going on and on and on and on. And then finally they held a hearing. They decided to hold a hearing on caregiver discrimination. They went back to the analytically correct title, and I was one of the key witnesses, along with, paired up with a management side employment lawyer from Paul Hastings, very fancy firm, who I took one look at him and I thought, you know, this guy's shoes cost more than my house. And he said, this is no news, this is not anything new, this is just a hodgepodge of you know, what we already knew, and I stoutly denied it. This is a new trend, right? And the EEOC, actually, this shows you why these naming things are so important. The chair of the EEOC was a African-American single mother named Naomi Earp. And in my opinion, the crucial part of the hearing was actually when I caught the Paul Hastings lawyer citing an overturned case. That was very sweet, although I thought, there goes an associate fired. I felt bad about that. And when Naomi Earp asked me, she said, well, I hear what you're saying, but I really believe in personal responsibility. And I said, I couldn't agree with you more. I absolutely believe in personal responsibility too. What I'm saying is that these mothers are trying to take personal responsibility and trying to support their children, and the employers are making it impossible. And I got her vote. It's very important, and this is one of the reasons why I think cause lawyering really needs to think hard about purity. Cause lawyering is about reaching an audience and about building a coalition. And purity often gets in the way of that. So we got the guidance. Some folks inside the EEOC wanted it to apply both to disparate treatment and to disparate impact. Disparate impact is basically litigating structural discrimination. So analytically, the ideal worker theory should have gone into disparate impact. I said I need that like a hole in the head. Courts hate it. I don't have the votes on the EEOC. I knew that my friend, the Republican who we had with us, would not go along with disparate impact guidance, or if she did, they weren't going to say anything I wanted to hear. And so I really opposed disparate impact and got a very narrow guidance that purported just to describe what was already in existence under current law. Controversial. Some people in the EEOC, I think, were pretty ticked. But that's all we did. And that's important because guidance is informally just the instructions from the EEOC commissioners to the investigators investigating complaints coming in. In fact, it's not, it doesn't have really any formal legal status. In fact, though, the guidance was hugely important, and the reason it was, well, here's the kind of thing that happened after the guidance. This is, we put out a PowerPoint saying, now we had an audience, so we put out a PowerPoint saying, here's family responsibilities discrimination, here's some typical scenarios. This computer hates me. Uh-oh. Oh. Okay, that's, at least I can go the other direction. Oh, that's too bad. Stuck there. Well, what somebody will maybe work on it, and the next beautiful screenshot was a screenshot of, yeah, you can just go over that. Was a screenshot of a management-side employment lawyer, and a lot of them did this. They just basically stole our PowerPoint and sold it to their clients for lots and lots of money. I thought, perfect. That was the plan. Of course, I have a funding problem, but that is dissemination, right? So the reason the guidance was important was as soon as the EEOC had acted, management-side law firms had a new business opportunity. They could go to their clients and say, what's new, what's hot, I happen to know. Family responsibilities discrimination. So all of a sudden, management-side employment lawyers loved us. Again, purity, I was very focused on what I called the 6-stakeholder model. And plaintiffs' employment lawyers were one of the stakeholders, but management-side employment lawyers in many ways played a more important role in disseminating family responsibilities discrimination than the plaintiffs' employment lawyers did. Our current perky idea is to get accommodation for pregnant women under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Accommodation simply means, well, I'll tell you my current favorite case, which is an administrative assistant had severe nausea. She was pregnant, and so she wanted to move her workstation closer to the bathrooms. Well, they decided that the proper response to this request was to insist that she get trained for high explosives immediately and have to carry them on a vest. I mean, it was such clear retaliation. Employers in the United States wait until pink and blue-collar women get pregnant, and then they use the women's need for a very simple accommodation, carry a water bottle. Walmart basically said to a woman, you can't carry a water bottle. She needed to carry a water bottle because she had persistent urinary tract infections as a result of pregnancy. Well, you look at the case law, and the case law says these women aren't, these women aren't disabled, they're just pregnant. This is a normal pregnancy. Anybody in the world can get an accommodation, but not these losers. They don't belong in the workplace in the first place. And so we published a report called Pregnant, Poor, and Fired that got the attention of the EEOC, the current chairman, a Democrat, and she got all head up about pregnancy discrimination. And meanwhile, we constructed a theory that while pregnancy is not per se, not itself a disability, pregnancy gives rise to many pregnancy-related disabilities. We thought a lot about that term. And, for example, pregnant women are much more likely to get carpal tunnel, you know, where you get from too much typing. And so the sort of killer argument is you can't be saying that if a worker gets carpal tunnel for any reason in the world other than pregnancy, that they're covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, but not if her carpal tunnel was caused by pregnancy. That is a direct violation of equality principles and an explicit violation of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which requires pregnant workers to be treated the same as other workers with a similar ability or inability to work. So again, we're still shoehorning into current law. I'm going to very quickly go over, because this is the legal story, but meanwhile we were working simultaneously on two other fronts, and I'll just take a few extra minutes to talk about those. Work-family issues are typically conceptualized around the experience of professional women, and in fact this veils the fact that there are three different problems, all spoken of as workplace flexibility, a truly loser term. For professional women, the problem is, and it's true increasingly for professional men if they want to take an active role in family caregiving, the problem is long hours and rigid career tracks. We have plenty of flexibility. We can work our 60, 80 hours anywhere, but I actually crunched the numbers again. Only 9% of American mothers work more than 50 hours a week. So I say to employers, if you think you're going to have a proportionate number of women in leadership, if you, off the bat, throw out 81% of mothers, it's just self-delusion. You're not going to, period. So that's professional women. But the poor have totally different problems. They don't have flexibility. They have extraordinary rigidity. These are very highly supervised workers. I actually wrote a report one time called "One Sick Child Away from Being Fired," and that describes the situation of low-wage workers. They also, in the United States, have a completely different problem of too little flexibility. They also have too much flexibility. They have what are called just-in-time schedules, where the employers very often post the schedules 3 days in advance, and the schedules change from day to day and week to week. And if you take 3 buses and finally arrive at your workplace, you can be sent home with no hours because you're a nurse's aide and the patient census is lower than the employer thought it would be. So that is a completely different problem. And then workers in the middle, the so-called missing middle, have a combination. They don't have such rigid schedule, unstable schedules, but many of them do, especially the men, have mandatory overtime. If you have people splitting childcare, mandatory overtime can cause the mother or father to lose their job because they have to get home to relieve the other parent. So this was the 3 Faces of Work-Family Conflict report. I put it out with the Center for American Progress, basically a Democratic think tank. The simple point here is the way we're trying to, the next step we see here is actually to work with the computer geeks who design scheduling software so that it becomes very easy, first of all, to calculate for employers to calculate the amount of money they lose through just-in-time scheduling because turnover rates reach as high as 500% with just-in-time scheduling because people can't show up, right? And it costs about 70% of an hourly worker's salary to replace them when they leave. So that's just throwing money down the tubes. So the computer scheduling needs to be designed so that point is brought home to employers, and then also I did a subsequent report gathering all best practices. Those best practices need to be built into the computer programs. So the simple point there is that law is sometimes the crucial social delivery mechanism, but not all the time. And I think it's really important for lawyers to not to skip the step of figuring out whether law is the proper social delivery mechanism. And then finally, the other thing we've done a lot of is trying to reframe social debates. This was the famous 2003 article by Lisa Belkin saying, why don't women get to the top? They don't want to. It's an opt-out revolution. I wrote a report called Opt-Out or Pushed Out, the real story of women in work, documenting, again with the help of my sociologist, former reporter, that the New York Times had been telling absolutely the same story since about 1973. And basically shamed reporters out of writing this story. And so when Anne-Marie Slaughter wrote now a very famous article called Why Women Can't Have It All last year, she did not, as Lisa did in this article, say women just have different values and their brains light up differently and that's why they don't want these jobs. Anne-Marie Slaughter said, you know what, this is a ripoff. The structure of work pushes women out. And I go, wow, that's a familiar argument. And then finally, I think this is a bad picture, but it's from a wonderful movie called About Schmidt. I think it's a very important movie about masculinity, and I've come to the conclusion right now that work-family conflict is really not a story about women at all. It's a story about men and masculinity. And that is the reason so little has changed, I think, in terms of voluntary change and in terms of women's ability to use the part-time and flexible policies that we've all spent so much time denying. Because gender pressures on men have changed very, very little. If you're not an ideal worker, you're a wuss. And if you're a wuss, you know what? I'm kind of brave, but I'm not brave enough to do that. For a man who crosses the femininity line, of course, the social sanctions are truly nuclear. So I organized another working group on what I called the flexibility stigma. Two social scientists study what happens to men when they either take leave or adopt a part-time schedule, and they get absolutely blown out of the water professionally. And the reason they do is because they're seen as too feminine. Well, kind of interesting. First of all, it makes it litigable, right? Gender discrimination. But I really think that in terms of work-family issues, again, this is, I think, the new shift of frame that we need. We shouldn't be talking about women. Feminism gets caught in the trance it seeks to break. Why are we talking about women? What's holding the system in place is gender pressures on men. Thank you.
Let's gather a few questions and yes, please.
It's not a question, actually, it's a remark. First of all, thank you very much for sharing having 2 children and wanting to quit your job. Because I have 2 children and I'm battling to create my future. So thank you for sharing.
I just don't do it.
Don't battle?
Don't quit.
Oh, I'm not quitting.
The clouds part once when your youngest is 4,
right.
and then when your youngest is 12, you get your life back. 12, that's not very far. 4, you get your sleep back. 12, you get your life back.
But actually, you have, it's not a remark, it's actually another. Your lecture was great in terms of, it took me forward of how important it is to name things. Like you changed the name from motherhood something.
Caregiver discrimination.
Family responsibility. That's a very important point.
Mm.
So thank you for sharing that too.
I wanted to ask about the tools you use for your work. maybe not urge us, but decided to quit the legislation?
I didn't think anything was going to happen. You know, I think some people are cut out to do the same thing year after 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 year after. That's what you have to do to get legislation. And then you get, you know, a sixth of a donut. That's just not me. It influences countrywide if you get the legislation. But if you don't, it doesn't influence anything. That's the problem. And I'm overstating the case because, of course, in building the case for legislation, you do some of the kind of public education that I also do. But I do think that, especially in the United States, in the work-family arena, where paid family leave is the holy grail, and we just, you know, so much of foundation funding is focused on paid family leave. There's almost nothing for anything else. I think that you need short-term strategies and long-term strategies. And the beauty of the short-term strategies is that I actually think the Center for Work-Life Law has changed a lot of stuff at the time when the debate over legislation has just been blocked for 3 decades. Right?
I'd like to hear your opinion about something. We have a wonderful law or bundle of laws regarding public workers. They have a beautiful possibility to take parental rights. I mean, same as mother's track. It can happen. Workers could turn to their. I'm sorry about my English.
It's much better than my Hebrew.
Turn to their employers and ask to get this right, but it is not happening. It doesn't happen. We have a beautiful law, but it doesn't happen. People don't know about it, and from personal experience, my husband is a
public servant.
As a public servant, and he asked it not taken seriously. What would happen if I would ask this right? And he was told blatantly, "You want to be promoted? Don't do it." So how can we make this change in public opinion?
I think it's, that's why I think, I mean, you have pinpointed the importance of gender pressures on men, right? I mean, there's two things that you pinpointed. The reason that I formed the Flexibility Stigma Working Group is that, of course, in the United States, the social tool that actually works is discrimination law. I mean, how crazy to handle work-family conflict through discrimination law? But on the other hand, it's better than nothing. And so what I wanted to do is to create a situation where we could litigate that precise situation as gender discrimination, which, by the way, it is, right? Because a woman would not have met with that response. And so part of, I think litigation is part of the answer. And I think the other part of the answer is, and this is harder, and something I'm thinking about a lot, is because we work a lot with these sort of corporate social responsibility discourse, is to say, you know, if you're really serious about wanting a proportionate number of women, that when an employer comes up and talks to me, the first question I ask them now is, do all of your men take parental leave? And if they say no, I say you've got a climate problem. And I think the climate problem has to start with making it possible for men to make caregiving responsibilities salient. One of these studies from the Flexibility Stigma journal shows, this was actually blue-collar guys in Toronto, that blue-collar guys who, they didn't ask for leave, they didn't ask for workplace flexibilities, they just disclosed that they had caregiving responsibilities. They suffered very high levels of masculinity harassment. So basically what we have is an increasing demand by younger men to play an active role in family care, and the workplace structure is making it impossible for them to do that. And so I think we have to start to talk about that. And I know when I was on I mean, it's kind of unusual for a feminist to be like so focused on men, but when I was on book tour for this Reshaping the Work-Family Debate, Why Men in Class Matter, I literally had young men coming up to me in tears saying, I can't believe you're talking about this. Nobody talks about this. Until we start, that's going to happen.
So my question is, when you're shifting from the family to the workplace, not to bargain with the family, but really to
Oh, keep bargaining, but it's hard.
Not to focus
Yeah.
on family and focus on the workplace. So my question is, what do you think works best when you're talking with employers? Is it rights? Is it utilitarian? Is it it's the right thing to do? Is it what is the discourse? Because you know that it's structural, right? You know that the problem is that this is how workplace has been structured, and you want to reshape it. So, but how do you approach the HR people? Is it the threat of a lawsuit? Is it what? CSR?
Yeah.
What works best?
Yeah. I mean, I left out the whole process by which we created and disseminated the modern part-time policy in law firms and the half-time tenure track in academia. And that's, so we have a whole nother line of work that works directly with employers. And, you know, as always, you have to speak in the coin of the realm. The coin of the realm for them is the bottom line. So, I mean, you notice I did it when I was talking about the just-in-time schedule. You guys are idiots. You're throwing money down the toilet. You have a 500% turnover rate. That doesn't make sense. Well, I haven't been able to get money to disseminate the report. But with respect to where I have gotten money, with respect to the legal profession, you know, we played through an organization called the Project for Attorney Retention, which is part of WorkLife Law. We very early documented how much it cost to lose a second-year associate. It cost over $200,000. And that gained a lot of attention and really was very, very influential. The problem, so the language you use is the language of the incentives of your audience. So if you're talking to business, their incentives focused around profits, so you have to talk about profits.
And is it always profitable to do it?
I believe it is, because I think it's insane from a macroeconomic standpoint to spend all this money educating women and then design work to systematically push them out. Just a guess. And from a microeconomic standpoint, there is a huge literature documenting that retention, you know, high levels of attrition are incredibly expensive, that working 60 hours a week is not, your productivity per hour is low, and there's a whole business case. There's 25 years of this literature. The problem is, and this is the flexibility stigma stuff again, the problem is that it's very difficult to get businesses to actually believe this, partly because the costs of the current system are coded as inevitable costs of doing business, and the costs of, you know, the first penny that you have to spend to change it is coded as something that is an avoidable cost, that you're just a do-gooding. And so there's a cognitive process that is really disserving us. And so one of the things, the conversation I'm just opening up now is to talk about that cognitive process and why the business case fails to persuade. And I haven't really figured that one out, but I've seen enough people. Actually, the Marissa Myers thing, you know, our friend Marissa eliminated telecommuting. You won't, don't quote me, you'll hear me supporting her in public. I support women in high positions in public. They have a hard enough time without me dumping on them. However, the coverage of that discounted incredible numbers of studies that show that telecommuting makes people more productive, as if productivity was some sort of like little do-gooder side issue, right? And said, oh, the reason that she's eliminating telecommuting, she was eliminating telecommuting because it was really badly managed and people were ripping her off, right? Was that the reason she was eliminating telecommuting was because everybody knows that you can't innovate if you're telecommuting. Based on no evidence. There is no evidence that you can't innovate with telecommuting. The evidence is that in the Silicon Valley type of environment, you do need informal face-to-face interactions in order to, you know, produce that new coding. That's not inconsistent with telecommuting. You need the brilliant idea, and then you need to work it out, for which you need some peace and quiet. That's why you go home to telecommute. That was absolute. So this was a good example of no matter how much I have stopped documenting the business case, except in the low-wage context, because it's really novel there, because it's just people don't believe the evidence, which is kind of why it's nice to sue them.
Parents getting more rights when who choose not to be a parent. And my question is, don't you feel that in the same act you're giving rights for parents, but you are also convincing them that's the right way to live, and we should all be parents if we want to live a normal, healthy life, and the rest of the people should not get this more human workplace, and other models of family are outside it.
Actually, first of all, what I have done, I'd like to think, is applied queer theory to the hegemony. I'm only interested in the hegemony. But I've applied queer theory to the hegemony and tried to show people that they're performing gender all the time and that that's a choice, and that it's a sort of a sorry choice, and that there are other choices. But also, when they do, most people are really conventional. I'm really conventional. Most people are really conventional. So I do think it's important that when people do the conventional thing, that it isn't a straight path to poverty for women and a straight path to emotional poverty for men. So I do completely defend trying to improve life for those who live the hegemony. However, I'm also very against the idea of reinforcing heteronormativity and reinforcing having pressure on people, which I gather is kind of intense in Israel, to have children. Because, I mean, what I say to the press all the time is, I absolutely defend the right of anyone who doesn't want to have a child not to have a child. Take it from me, it's really hard. I don't, for children's sake, I don't want anyone who really doesn't want a kid badly to have a kid. I really don't want to. And so you notice how I flipped, and in defense, I appear to be defending the hegemony, but I'm really defending a queer choice. The other thing I say to the press all the time is, people, because reporters always ask me this question. So, okay, all the mommies are going to leave at 3 to take Susie to soccer, and who's going to be left? And what I say is, I'm not defending that. That's bad management. Because there is no way that you can do a few favors for a few people and not marginalize those few people and create really poisonous workplace dynamics that are ultimately going to disadvantage them. And what I am trying to stand up for is that people should be able to balance work with other goals and dreams. Sometimes that's family, sometimes it isn't. And actually the frontier now, and this goes back to your question about the business case, the conversation that we really need to start is to say, this is really, what we're really talking about, and again, we're talking about the elite now, but in the elite, what we're really talking about is not a work-family balance problem, it's a long hours problem. It's a long hours problem for everyone. And so long as we don't basically deconstruct that ideal worker for everyone, whatever we create for women is going to be garbage anyway. I mean, that's what we've seen. It's actually not garbage. It's better than it was. It's better than being literally run out of town. But it is, for most women, pretty permanent marginalization.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I found your description of the ideal worker very compelling. And I was wondering if you could paint for us a portrait of the ideal worker. Like, how would you want the ideal worker?
I mean, this is an intellectually challenging question. I will answer it, and then I'm going to tell you why I don't usually answer it. For me, the ideal is the ideal of a balanced worker. The worker who is balancing, is having what Freud said we all wanted, which is love and work, right? Work is an important part of a human life. You know, if you're the person who mistook their life for a job, the person who mistook your job for a life, I actually think that's kind of, you know, I'm close to it, I admit it, but I don't think it's the proper way of human flourishing. And so what I think is the ideal of someone who is very committed to very rewarding work, but also has other things that they're balancing that with. I don't usually say that in public because it's for the queer theory reason. It sounds very judgmental. And a whole other body of work I have, there's a lot of structured conflicts among women, particularly over the extent to which they assimilate to masculinity. And for a woman like me to say that in public is judging a whole group of women that, I mean, it's just not my social role to be undermining. So keep it on the down low.
No, cool. Ina?
Very central in our lives. So when we're talking about work-life balance, what if one's life is its work? And I'm wondering whether we should change the discourse to go back and talk about work-leisure balance. And everyone defines his leisure time as he or she pleases. Well, your answer just that's my concern. Because I think this project, what it does, it's incredibly important and contributing, but we really have to think about the centrality of work ethic in our life as defining certain inclusion, involvement.
No, I mean, point taken. I mean, the social environment in which I operate, the North American elite, is completely nutso about work. It's just bizarre the role that work plays in our life, including mine. No judgment there, excluding mine. It is really strange. So I do hear you. I do hear that. I would never, as a social outreach tool, talk about work-leisure balance. That is like take, aim, shoot, foot. That wouldn't work, right? At least in the United States. Maybe it would in Israel. It just wouldn't work. That's what I call crossing the dingbat line. You just, at a certain point, people's minds blow up and they think you're a dingbat, right? For the same reason I started, I mean, I'm basically a care work person, right? That's really what I am. I'm talking about reshaping market work around care work. All of this is a different way to say what I just said. I don't even use the word care work. And I dropped caregiving. Why? It has the little pink bow. You need to convey authority. You need to give a masculine gender performance. So, again, I didn't make the world. I'm just trying to move from point A to point B in the world I inherited.
As a partner of someone who's working company there for the workers here to work their hours for their needs, and it's actually breaking almost any labor rule
I was going to say sue him.
inherited here. And the choice that you have to do, whether you're a male or female, doesn't make a difference. You really have to enslave yourself in order to keep working. And because if you don't, once you decide that family is more important, whether you have kids or not, your free time is more important, your health is more important, and it creates a big indifference.
I live 35 minutes from Silicon Valley. I mean, the ideal worker in Silicon Valley is, as we all know, a 23-year-old white male who, if you do his laundry and feed him food, will and give him access to computer games, will stay forever, right? Not that I ever engage in gender stereotyping, guys, right? Far be it from me to do such a bad and nasty thing. And so, I mean, what Silicon Valley, first of all, I mean, if a company's misbehaving and not observing local law, there's an obvious remedy there. But one of the things I'm trying to figure out how to do, and as you can imagine, it's politically an extremely complicated thing, is to say to Silicon Valley, you know, are you guys interested in having women? There's only 11% of computer scientists in the United States are women. And in Computer Valley, in Silicon Valley, the women's representation is paltry. And so it's a very complicated thing for me to do. But what I would like to do is to raise the ante on the professional responsibility and the corporate social responsibility, and basically say, are you interested in having a proportionate number of women? Well, if you are, this is what you should be doing. Just two things. Address the long hours problem and redesign your business systems to control for implicit bias. And if you're not doing those two things, I don't care how many women's initiatives you have, you are not interested in this problem, and I'm not interested in talking to you. I would never say that in public. I guess this is being, because then I would never get any funding.
I read your article, I think it's from 2007, and the way you described the cases reminded me the 1960s, 70 cases of age discrimination,
yes,
race discrimination, where the employers were expressing themselves in a very blunt way, very out there.
Loose lips.
Yeah, you didn't have to work very hard to prove the actual motives of the discrimination. And I think right now, those kind of expressions in those areas of discrimination, age, race, sex, you won't find them because the employers became more sophisticated. They don't fire the black worker because she's black, but because she's not very good in her work. And aren't you afraid or worried about the fact that employers will become more sophisticated in this area?
That's actually success. You know, to move this from the first stage, you're right, this is basically 1970s style discrimination against mothers. That's what existed when we started, and to a significant extent, that's what still exists. To drive that kind of discrimination underground is a great achievement. It's also a paltry achievement, right? Again, it's very difficult to change social norms, particularly social norms that are deeply, deeply embedded into identity. The only real way to solve this problem is to make the people who control government, corporations, all the rest of it, really very deeply question whether they have wasted their lives by doing nothing but work and being having such a tenuous relationship with anything. How are we going to do that? I mean, that's the answer, right? But that's kind of impossible. So we're going to have to, I mean, it's not impossible. I think it's worth trying. I'm going to try it. But meanwhile, we have to take these small gains. I mean, to have women, I can't resist showing you this one slide a little bit farther. I hate this. This is 2011. We don't get people like you down here in Monroe, Louisiana, who have as much telecom experience and advertising agency experience with a degree from Northwestern. But you've got a lot of personal distractions right now. You have a new baby at home, and I don't think you have the fire in you to be one of my leaders. I want to drive that underground. 2011.
How was this approved? Was this like recording?
Case settled. Before we started, that she would not have had a cause of action, in my view.
The question is, I think that race and sex and age discrimination are still out there, but we just can't catch them.
Of course they are. Of course they are. First of all, I think you can, I mean, I've only talked about some of what I do. I basically have taken this experimental social psychology and boiled it down into 4 patterns. It's, check it out. It's called the New Girls Network. Please click on it. We need your clicks. Basically, it's a new way. Well, it's just an advice column, really, but it's also a new way of litigating glass ceiling discrimination cases, because once you understand the way people talk that are expressions of gender bias, you can litigate those glass ceiling cases in a very different way. I took that literature, 35 years, hundreds of studies, boiled it down to 4 patterns, and then interviewed like 130 professional women and said, gee, any of this sound familiar? One woman said every syllable. One woman said, you just described my life. And one Latina woman just burst into tears. There's a big academic controversy about whether these experimental studies actually are relevant in the workplace. They are. And if you disseminate that, that subtle discrimination becomes less subtle. You know what? That subtle discrimination isn't subtle at all. And I think we actually kind of do it a disservice by calling it subtle.
Back to the terms family and caregiving, I'm wondering if and how you include giving care to other family members, not just children, parents, siblings, partners.
From the beginning, this is really care work. And I tend to focus on children because 45 minutes is a lot of time, but it's not a lot of time. But from the very beginning, our mission has not been only children, not been only mothers, for 2 reasons. Number one, it's crazy. I mean, care work is care work. So it's just, I'm a care work person. The other thing is, even if you only do care about mothers, you can't help mothers. If you create a situation where if somebody needs a flexible schedule because her partner is ill, she can't get it, but the mother can get it, that mother's going to end up quitting, right? And you're going to, because of the poisonous atmosphere that's going to be created. So everything I've said, and part of the reason I focused on motherhood is because we have these, the discrimination against mothers is really emblematic of the discrimination against all caregivers. So it's the strongest case. And I do think, as a matter of a social persuasion, therefore it makes sense to put it out front, right? But whatever you get for mothers, you're going to get for everybody, just as whatever you get for mothers in terms of workplace flexibility, you're going to get for people without children, because that's the only feasible way to implement that kind of program. You can't give it just to mothers if you're serious about it. And you also can't, for example, we do a lot of work with universities. That's one of the industries we do a lot of work with. And one of the best practices that we always that we've disseminated is that if you have a stop the clock policy, do you know what that is? You stop the tenure clock if someone has a baby. But you shouldn't only do it if someone has a baby. You should do it, the person who is stopping the clock, first of all, should have to certify that they're doing 20 hours a week of care work, so that you don't have men married to housewives using this as a research leave. And the other thing is you should never have that kind of policy if it's not also available for elder care and care of partners and care of disabled people. Because if you don't do that, you're going to create, number one, doesn't make sense. Number two, you're going to create a poisonous atmosphere. So that's, I mean, and you know, again, in terms of the organizations doing that kind of work, that's kind of unusual. We're very, very conscientious about that and rigorous. And it's partly because, you know, I'm getting really old, so my kids aren't the issue.
It's also the answer to the guy's question, what about people who don't want to have children?
That's right.
They have parents, they have partners, they have others, so it's not really much.
Yeah, although, I mean, there's two stages. One is, are we fighting only for care work, or are we fighting for life, right, for leisure? I actually, intellectually, what I'm engaged in is fighting for care work, right? That's just, I mean, beyond that, my mind just explodes.
You talked about several different tools you work with to make social change, and you didn't mention organized work and unions. Do you still offer them? Do you work with them?
I used to. Only 7% of private employees in the United States are unionized. Unions, or is it private employers? I can't remember. I think it's 7% of the American workforce who works for private employers is unionized. And it's falling. Unions in the United States are so embattled that they very properly put organizing above everything else. I've worked all of this work with about low-wage workers and one sick child away from being fired. Those studies were based on my study of union arbitrations. So we have worked with unions, but this is not their first priority. That's one of the reasons there's going to be no legislation in the United States. If you think there's going to be workers' legislation in the United States where it's not a priority for unions, you know, God bless you.
One last question.
Yes, actually, there's a good research which I've heard over a radio station that said of, let's say, 10,000 people who are about to die in the last moment, and they asked them, what do you regret? Are you familiar with that study?
No.
What do you regret the most? Number one answer was, I regret that I worked so much.
Wow. Can you send an email to worklifelaw.org? Seriously? Send me an email with a site to this. Oh, you just heard on the radio.
Yes, but I'm sure you could find it.
Okay.
They said it's the biggest
Fascinating.
research I've done. Number two was not spending enough time with the family, but the number one issue was on bed when you're about to die was spending so much time on work. So I guess talking empirically, this is a good evidence of.
Yeah. I mean, as my understanding is that Israel, I always say, this may no longer be true, in the United States, we work the longest hours of any industrialized country, including Japan, which has a word for death from overwork. I think you guys are close to us. Past you? Congratulations. You know, it's, I mean, I think, and I've thought a lot about why the United States is so nutsy. It may be a similar reason to why, to what's going on in Israel. We're nations of immigrants. I mean, the people with get up and go got up and came here. I think that, you know, just it's sort of the nightmare of if you lived in a dorm in first year of law school, you just go like, all of these people are too type A, they shouldn't be together. Thank you.
We have a 15 minutes break, and then we have the second panel that is really related to this topic, so it will be interesting.